it's a process of being inspired by. So we start with, what are we inspired by? We can go to museums, we can watch a sunset, but at the end of the day, and we may be inspired by what we see, but the real gift or the real opportunity, what really sets people apart, is the people who are willing to move to being inspired to take action. And it's this process of transcendence that the literature describes, moving from being inspired by to inspired to, that really separates people who go on to produce creative works. I think the key is this positive versus negative affect and how we view the world. So we don't view challenges as stumbling blocks as much as we view them as opportunities, and realizing that the more challenges we come across, the fewer and fewer people or other companies that we'll see along our journey. And rather than having that be a lonely and scary feeling, we actually find comfort and inspiration in that. We use this process of transcendence to tackle not just everyday problems, but our goal is really to seek out what we call wicked problems. Wicked problems have their, they can be traced back to Dr. Horace Riddle, who was a professor at UC Berkeley and the College of Environment and Design back in the 60s. And he described wicked problems in the social context, saying that they're ill-formulated, the information is confusing, there are many stakeholders and who are matched with decision makers, and there's conflicting values between those two. And that the ramifications on the system are not only confusing, but I might argue addressing the wrong symptom could make the underlying cure worse, or the underlying disease worse. Probably sounds like medicine in a way. And as we think about it, for example, we're looking at, you can try and design a medical system that provides equal care for all those that come in to that system. But the key word there is for people who come into the system. And what about people who can't enter the system, won't enter the system? And how can we design for them to include them and make it a yes and environment rather than a yes but? Or 8 simple elements, I should say. The first element is creativity. And so creativity is the most widely stated attribute of the design thinking mindset in their survey of the literature. And when we think of creativity, it's not simply like artistic creativity. In this sense, we're just saying, do we have this innate ability to look at problems from a unique perspective? And do we also view the solutions to those problems allowing for unorthodox or developing unorthodox type resolutions? That leads to the second, which is empathy. And empathy, I think, goes hand in hand with creativity. Myself, I'm very often put myself in someone else's shoes. So just very recently, my daughter's in 1st grade. I realized, I was aware that I was bringing a summer of anxiety about distance learning. I was bringing all of that drama to bear on this poor 1st grade teacher. Now, I didn't say anything to her, but it was my self-talk and my opinion of the experience was feeling really, really negative. And I took a minute and just practiced some empathy. And I said, well, what could this woman be experiencing? And nothing about her particularly, but what would the average 1st grade teacher be experiencing in this moment? And that helped me kind of soften my stance and realize that the most important thing was that my daughter was happy, and that the fact that this teacher was taking the first 2 weeks of class to just get to know the students was really important, because that was what was important to my daughter. And as the weeks have gone on, the curriculum's gotten more intense, and so it's all played out, but I had to have empathy for her situation. And that's an example of cognitive empathy and learned empathy, which are sort of the 2 elements the literature talks about in terms of this feeling. Cognitive empathy is, again, saying, gosh, I read an article, or I read a book, or I heard a podcast, and I know how teachers feel. Whereas on the other hand, I can take that emotional empathy and say, well, I'm a teacher myself, so let me tap into that root of anxiety that I often experience starting a new class. And how can I channel that into this conversation in a healthy way? And that's an example of those two elements of empathy. The third is optimism. So as design thinkers, we're inherently optimistic, not meaning that we're Pollyannas and always hoping for the best. We understand that challenges can come about in design thinking and in a team context for certain. But how do we keep that North Star in mind as we move forward? And I think that's the most important thing, is to set that North Star in the beginning. What is our objective for our user? And if we keep that in mind, it'll guide so many decisions throughout the process. And it's that inherent sense of optimism of doing right by your user that's most important. And then at the halfway point, we talk about iteration, and iteration is literally not falling in love with the product. And again, as we talked about, you can have this, we could have a back and forth for days, weeks about the word vulnerability and is it positive or negative. But at some point, you should be able to put it into your experiment, because your experiment should have low enough stakes that either the people participating or the outcomes provide room for this kind of learn by doing aspect of design thinking. Iteration is valuable, obviously, when you're prototyping, to yes and, again, not only ideas, concepts, but also physical manifestations of prototypes and so forth. And again, when we do our consulting engagements, it's natural to see folks, once they get a data point that supports their pre-existing belief, it's natural for them to want to dig in and hold on to that data point because it reinforces the status quo. Whereas design thinking is inherently meant to reframe or invert the situation. I pause there to see if you have any questions, comments, or examples of any of these four mindsets you'd like to share. Cool.
No, I think I agree with what you've said so far. It makes sense.
All right. It's hopefully not too controversial, but I do appreciate your yes ands along the way. The next is this idea of collaboration, and that design thinking is a team sport. As Clark, my colleague, likes to say, that one of the goals is to actually make your teammates successful. So if there's a superstar on one team, that's not really a great design thinking team if they can't work well with others. So always seek that element of collaboration, and not only amongst your team, but also with your users. It's very natural to want to invite users to prototyping sessions or to have them sit in on ideation sessions, because it's that collaboration that yields the richest outcomes. Visualization, we think in words and pictures. Back in the day when we were in the studio, right, everyone wants to write with words on their Post-it note. Well, why aren't they sketching? And so in this case, we continue. I always have paper in front of me. There's just some random lines on my paper, but it's just me getting thoughts out and giving myself time to process. The idea of this Gestalt view, which is where we, again, talk more about questioning the status quo and not being bound by those orthodoxies that we bring to the table, but be willing to question. And then finally, comfort with ambiguity, which is not always easy for folks. Many people like predictability. And not that we throw predictability to the wind, because as I'll talk about, we root design thinking in a process, right? But that ambiguity of the outcomes and of any kind of process, of an ideation session or a prototype or an experimentation, it's that ambiguity that's critical. The process is very, at its most basic, at its core, is this process of diverging and converging. Whether you're an MBA, an MPH, an MD, you have a certain amount of knowledge and you hone your skills of converging from that set of knowledge to an answer in the shortest time possible. And we go and get additional degrees to expand our knowledge base, but yet we still intend to converge in the same amount of time. What design thinking says is that it's not so much how quickly we come up with the answer, but before that, ensure that we're asking the right problem, asking the right question. And so this is the double diamond method of design thinking, which was created by the UK Design Council. And what it does here is if you start with your problem and you just diverge, you discover, learn as much as you can about the opportunity space, your users, etc., and then define that space by converging into that problem definition space. Once you've defined that, this dot here in the middle represents what I like to think of as the how might we question. It's only at that halfway point can we truly define what we're actually going after. And then at that point, we develop new solutions and then create prototypes and deliver those prototypes for experimentation. And then once we reach the end with those learnings, double back and start at the beginning and continue this double diamond approach of diverging and converging, asking the right questions before seeking insights, exploring all possible solutions before developing a prototype or an experiment. Again, it's very intuitive, but it can be difficult in practice. And that's what we take the time to understand here. So as we like to describe the design thinking process, it's a scalable, iterative process of innovation based on shared language and skills. I like to think of it as the Intel inside of innovation. Or for entrepreneurs, you use design thinking to find product market fit. You don't use design thinking to scale. You just find that human-centered solution. Then you turn it over and adopt more lean startup methodologies as you seek to scale. First, in the lower left-hand corner of this 2x2, the first step of design thinking is observe and understand. This is where we'll conduct desk research, reviewing scholarly journals, listening to podcasts that have first-person interviews, maybe watching YouTube testimonials or any Facebook videos that show somebody engaged in the process that we're, or the space that we're looking to explore. With that knowledge, we then conduct user interviews, and those user interviews give us our own first-person experiences that we compare and contrast against our desk research. We take all of that field work back to the lab, and we reach our second point, which is extracting insights. Insights are badly explained as 1 + 1 is 3. What are we really trying to do? We use a very simple formula where we say, what is the user's need? What is their dilemma? What's their wish, want, or change? So the need might be, I want a doctor that looks like me. Maybe I'm an underrepresented minority, or I'm a woman faced with a male gynecologist, etc. I may not be comfortable. So I want a doctor that looks like me. Well, what's my dilemma? The dilemma is that, the medical field underrepresents, minority ethnicities and races. Okay, well, what do we do here? Well, the wish, want, or change is, how can I meet a doctor that looks like me without having to make significant changes to how I engage the healthcare system? So for example, if I work with Kaiser, I shouldn't have to change to XYZ health plan just to find an African-American doctor. And so then this breeds a lot of how might we and yes and solutions that can be pretty unique. So for example, how do we embrace, well, telemedicine, everybody wants telemedicine because of COVID, but what if telemedicine became a way to scale some of these underrepresented doctors to a broader community of patients and allow them to have a bigger impact? That's an example of idea generation here in the third phase. And then after that, we'll prototype an experiment. So if we were going to prototype a telemedicine solution, we wouldn't start by building a telemedicine platform, right? We wouldn't spend hundreds of thousands of dollars reinventing something that we could simulate with an off-the-shelf product. So as I like to say, the best form of prototyping is stories. Just like I told you before about my idea that we're working on. You gave me your feedback around the word vulnerability. That was free feedback. That's completely invaluable to me. And then the next time we experiment or we prototype, we're going to put a $100 limit on it. So outside of the cost of our time, we can't spend more than $100 on outside consultants or materials or anything. We have to be very scrappy in the sense that it allows us to not get caught up in creating an elegant solution, but allows us to stay focused on the user. Famous story there is when, a long time ago at this point, but when Starbucks was piloting their order ahead service at the shops, the coffee shops where they were piloting it, they literally had a barista behind the counter with just a cell phone, and they gave their regulars the number of this cell phone, and the regulars would just send an SMS with their order. And then they could work out some of the initial operations kinks to that and then begin to build a more robust solution on top of it. But huge, huge learnings for not a lot of money. And that's really the design thinking process. So again, reflecting on the mindset embraces ideas like creativity, empathy, iteration, optimism, ambiguity. The process is really rooted in this diverge-converge process. And here at Haas, we teach it as a 4-phase process, meaning observe and understand is a diverge process, extracting insights is a converging process, generating ideas is a diverging process, and then prototyping and experimenting is a converging process. Then in the lower right-hand corner, once we hit that, then we start the process over again and continue to iterate until we reach that product market fit.